Chapter 17 and 18 of the Maxwell story by Carolyn Wells. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 17. Big Jack Judson. We went back to the house rather elated with our success. But when we told the others what we proposed to do, our plan did not meet with entire approval. The Maxwells thought it a hopeless quest. Edith Whiting said it could not possibly lead to anything worth while. And as for Hunt, he openly ridiculed the whole thing. Miss Gardner, too, endeavored to dissuade us. "Why, Mr. King," she said, "it's utterly absurd to think you can find that car or those people after nearly a week has passed." "But we can at least try, Miss Gardner," I said, wondering at her persistence. "But what's the use, when you know you can't catch them?" "What's the use of any endeavor? And there's always a chance that it may succeed." "Well, then, may I go with you?" "Why, certainly," I replied. "So far as I'm concerned, I should be delighted to have you. Perhaps Mrs. Whiting will go, too." We spent most of the evening in grave discussion. There was an undercurrent of disturbance that I could not understand. At one moment we would seem to be all working harmoniously in the same direction. And then one or another would fly off at a tangent with some inexplicable remark or criticism. But since Mr. Maxwell and his sister raised no real objection to our going, though they had little hope of its successful result, I paid scant heed to others' advices. Miss Gardner's attitude bothered me most. She seemed determined to persuade us not to go, but she took no definite stand in the matter. She merely implied her opinions and made vague suggestions that we might get into trouble by interfering with what was doubtless a party of young men on a pleasure trip. "Even if that car did come in and go around the house and out again," said Miss Gardner almost angrily, "that doesn't prove the men criminals. Why, they might not even have known Philip or Mildred." "But they asked the innkeeper where the Maxwells lived," I reminded her. "Probably because this is the show place of the town and they wanted to see it," she retorted. "But they wouldn't come at 10 o'clock at night to see it," exclaimed Tom Whiting. "I don't know, Irene, why you're so afraid we'll find those men." "I'm not afraid of any such thing," responded Miss Gardner, with a rising color at the implied accusation. "How should I know or care who the men are?" "You were on the upper veranda when they came," went on Tom. "And I have told you that I saw no one," and Irene spoke coldly, and rising immediately left the room. "Now she's mad," said Whiting, with a sigh, "but I do think that girl is holding something back." "Oh, surely she can't know anything about it that she won't tell," said Miss Maxwell, looking anxious. "I can't bear to think Irene deceitful." "She isn't deceitful," I declared. "I don't believe she knows anything she hasn't told, but if she does, you may depend upon it she is withholding it from right motives." "I can't imagine any right motive for concealing the truth in a case like this," said Whiting sternly. "She may be shielding somebody else." Miss Lathrop said this in her most insinuating tones, and I at once had a conviction that she only said it to involve Irene. If so, I determined to call her bluff. "Just what do you mean by that, Miss Lathrop?" I inquired. "If you know that Miss Gardner is shielding somebody, surely you ought not to withhold the fact." "I know nothing about Miss Gardner," said the nurse, pursing her lips primly. "It is not for me to have opinions on this matter at all." "Quite so," I returned coolly. "I admit opinions are of little value. But if you know of any facts, you should not conceal them." "When I learn of any facts I will not conceal them," returned the nurse, and a gleam in her eye made me think that she looked forward hopefully to gaining such knowledge. Next morning we started on our trip to Millville. Miss Maxwell proposed that we take Miss Lathrop with us to give her some fresh air, and that she herself would sit with Millie in the absence of the nurse. Miss Leslie was slowly regaining her strength, but was still prostrated from the effects of the shock, and also by the delayed healing of her wound. She was allowed to see no one except those who took care of her. Of course this necessitated the Whitings' continued stay at Maxwell Chimneys, and as I was determined to see the case through, my stay was also indefinitely prolonged. As for Miss Gardner, she declared each morning that she was going home that day, and each afternoon concluded to stay longer. And so we started off for Millville, Tom Whiting and his wife in front, while I sat back with Miss Gardner and the nurse. It was a beautiful drive in the fresh morning air, and the roads were bordered with goldenrod and red sumac. The foliage was beginning to turn, and for a time the casual conversation was entirely regarding the weather and the scenery. And then Miss Gardner said abruptly, "Who is James Mordaunt?" "I never heard of him before," I replied. "But you know he isn't the one who asked Schwartz where the Maxwells lived." "What was his name?" demanded Irene, in a nervous tone. "I don't know, I'm sure. That's what we hope to find out in Millville." "I hope you won't," she exclaimed, and it seemed involuntary. "Why?" I said, and Miss Lathrop said "Why?" at the same moment. "Oh, I didn't exactly mean that, but I am so sure he can't be the criminal that I hate to see you get on a wrong trail." "I think that's rather a weak explanation of your speech, Miss Gardner," said the nurse, with one of her most annoying smiles. "Perhaps you can give a better explanation." And Miss Gardner's voice was coldly angry. But I had no desire to listen to a feminine quarrel, and I said pleasantly, "Miss Gardner's speech doesn't need an explanation. Indeed, we're all so bewildered by our conflicting thoughts that I fear we sometimes talk at random." "I fear some of us do," said Miss Lathrop shortly. But I diplomatically managed to keep peace between them, and at last we reached Millville. Our destination was the Prospect House, and we went directly there and interviewed the proprietor, Mr. Halkett, with whom we had talked over the telephone. He greeted us cordially and took us at once into his private parlor. I told him frankly that we wanted to know the names of those men who were with Mr. Mordaunt, but I did not tell him why we were inquiring. He told us that only the one name was registered, but that during their stay he had learned the others. There were 2 men named Green, and one, the big Western man, was Judson, and the chauffeur was Hopkins. "That Judson's the man," I declared, "whose name we want. What's his first name?" "John," said Mr. Halkett. "John Judson. But his comrades called him Jack or Juggins. They were a hearty lot of fellows, and all in gay spirits except big Judson." "Wasn't he?" asked Whiting eagerly. "No," returned Mr. Halkett. "He was moody and silent, and when the other men tried to cheer him up he would say, 'Let me alone, boys, I'm feeling down.'" "How long were they here?" I inquired. "Just over the one night. They arrived before midnight last Monday night, and went away the next morning, about 10 or 11. "Where did they go?" "Well, I don't know exactly, but they seemed to be making a tour along the southern New Jersey coast. I know they were going to Atlantic City and later to Cape May. They did say they'd stop here on their way back, but I never placed much dependence on those promises. Young fellows often think they'll come back the same way and then switch off to another road." "Where were they from?" asked Whiting. "Mordaunt registered from Philadelphia. And that big Judson was from out West. I don't know about the others." We asked further questions, but none brought any more definite information. We didn't want to let Mr. Halkett know that we had any sinister reason for wanting to find these men, and he probably thought they had been speeding or some such light offense as that. As we took our leave I fell back a little, and whispered to Mr. Halkett that if the party should return he was to telephone me at once and privately. This he agreed to do, and then we went back to Maxwell Chimneys. Our conference at home after this trip was more amiable than the one the night before. Miss Gardner seemed relieved that we had not traced the men, though I by no means felt inclined to drop our search for them, and I had my own notions of what I should do next. Miss Lathrop made no unkind remarks, but I couldn't help observing that she watched Irene stealthily, and with much the same assured expression that a cat watches a mouse. Mr. Maxwell merely observed that he couldn't believe Mr. Mordaunt was implicated in our tragedy, as he had never heard that name before. But when I went on to tell of big Jack Judson, known by his friends as Juggins, both Mr. Maxwell and his sister exclaimed in surprise. "That's the man!" declared Miss Maxwell. Juggins is the man who shot our Philip. Oh, how dreadful! And that's why he said, 'To think he should shoot me!' Mr. King, you have indeed found the criminal." And Miss Miranda burst into such hysterical sobbing that Miss Lathrop at once went over and took her in her arms. "There, there, Miranda," said her brother, "don't jump at conclusions. It couldn't have been he. Why, there wasn't time for such a thing." Then he turned to us and explained. "This Judson, or Juggins, as his classmates called him, was in Philip's class at college, but they were never friends. I don't know the reason, but there was a never-healed feud between them. Philip stayed away from class reunion because he didn't wish to meet Judson. I never forced my boy's confidence, and he never told me what it was all about, but I know they were enemies. My sister knows it, too, and that is why she now suspects this man of the crime. But I cannot think it. I can't believe that Judson came here secretly and shot my boy down in cold blood. No, Mr. King, I cannot think we have the criminal yet." This speech amazed me. If Judson were Phil's enemy, if he came to Hamilton that night and asked where the Maxwells lived, if his car, or the car he was in, was seen to enter and leave Maxwell Chimneys at the time of the murder, what more evidence save the man's own confession could be required? And the hotel man in Millville had told us that Judson was sad and gloomy, though his companions were merry. Surely, then, the others didn't know it, but Judson had stopped at Maxwell Chimneys just long enough to commit this dreadful deed, and then had gone on with them. I repeated all this to Mr. Maxwell, but he only shook his head. "Not likely," he said, "not likely. It was too sudden, too quickly done, to be even a possibility. And, too, they were not friends. There could not have been such bitter hatred as to culminate in murder. And they hadn't met for years." "You don't know that, Mr. Maxwell," I argued. "They may have met elsewhere than here, or they may have corresponded. At any rate, the circumstances are too suspicious to be ignored. Judson must be found and questioned, if only to give him the chance of clearing himself." "I suppose that is so," agreed Mr. Maxwell, beginning to take a more rational view of the case. "Go ahead, then, Mr. King, in your own way. I will not interfere. But don't accuse Judson without giving him a chance to explain himself." I promised this, and then I went away to confer with Hunt as to this new development. It was about 7:00 that same evening, when, as I chanced to be alone in the music room, Miss Lathrop came to me, and as she approached put her finger to her lips in a warning manner. "I must speak to you alone, Mr. King," she whispered. "We are alone," I answered a little coldly, for her manner irritated me. "Yes," she said, "if we're not interrupted. Now listen while I tell you something." "I am listening," I said, really annoyed by her important and mysterious manner. "Don't be so rude. You'll change your tune when you hear what I have to tell you." "What have you to tell me?" I asked more gently, for I suddenly realized that if I antagonized her I might miss some real information. "Only this. Miss Gardner has just mailed a letter addressed to Mr. John Judson." "What?" "Don't speak so loud. It is just as I tell you. So, you see, they are colleagues." "They are what?" "Do stop asking absurd questions. You heard me. I tell you because I think you ought to know that Miss Gardner is in correspondence with that man." "She isn't in correspondence with him." "Well, she has just written him, at any rate. And she must be in correspondence with him, or how could she know his address?" "What is his address?" "The letter is directed to him at Cape May." I had recovered from my first dazed bewilderment, and though still angry, I knew it was better not to show this. Moreover, if what the nurse told me was true, as of course it must be, I must find out all I could from her. "How do you know this? You've been prying into Miss Gardner's private affairs." "Is not that allowable if one is tracking a murderer?" I could not restrain my anger entirely. "I didn't know you were officially employed in this matter," I flung at her. "Nor am I," she said proudly. "If my voluntary assistance is scorned, I will discontinue it." She turned away, and I saw I was defeating my own ends. "Wait a moment, Miss Lathrop," I begged. "I ask your pardon if I have offended you, but I'm nearly at my wits' end in this matter, and your revelation is indeed a surprise to me. How did you discover this letter?" "I happened to take a letter myself to the mail box in the hall, and I found the footman just emptying the box to take the letters to the post office. I chanced to see the name Judson on one of them, and naturally it caught my eye. So I looked at the letter, and saw that it was in Miss Gardner's handwriting. I noted the address, and I said nothing to anyone else, but brought the information directly to you. Have I done right?" "You have certainly done right in telling me about it, Miss Lathrop. May I ask you not to mention it to anyone else, at least not for the present?" "I will not mention it," said Miss Lathrop, and then she glided swiftly away, and I was left to ponder on her astonishing news. But after only a short consideration, I decided to go at once to Miss Gardner and ask for the truth. There could be no ordinary or innocent reason why she should be corresponding with the man we suspected of a crime. She must have concealed knowledge of some sort, whether guilty or not. It was nearly dinner time, but I sent a message to her asking her to see me at once for a moment in the music room. She came down almost immediately, and as she entered, though her manner was cold and distant, I thought I had never seen her look more beautiful. Her soft, trailing black gown was most becoming, and a gauzy black scarf that veiled her white shoulders seemed to add to her dignity and hauteur. "You sent for me," she said without a smile, and in low, level tones. "I did," I replied, "and I'm going to tell you frankly why I did so. I have learned, Miss Gardner, that you have just sent a letter to Mr. John Judson." "Have I not a right to send letters to whom I choose?" "You certainly have. But when such a letter proves that you know the address of the man we are looking for, I have a right to ask you what you know of him, and why you conceal from us the fact that you do know him." "And if you have a right to ask those questions, I also have a right to refuse to answer them." "You have that right, but is it wise to exercise it, Miss Gardner? Please drop this antagonistic attitude, and if you're not willing to help us in our search, won't you tell me why?" "I'm not willing to help you in your search, and I refuse to tell you why." Miss Gardner spoke deliberately, and turning slowly left the room. It may have been my imagination, but I thought she hesitated an instant at the doorway, as if half hoping I would call her back. But I did not do so, as I knew it was but a few moments before dinner time, and I quickly concluded to wait until the evening, and then endeavor to get her alone for a more protracted interview. All through the meal I was preoccupied and found it difficult to control my thoughts sufficiently to take part in the general conversation. Moreover, when I lifted my eyes, I invariably found either Miss Gardner or Miss Lathrop regarding me intently, and I found it embarrassing to meet their gaze. 18. A pistol shot. Dinner was nearly over when I was called to the telephone. Excusing myself from the table, I answered the summons, only to find that it was Mr. Halkett of the Millville Hotel who wished to speak to me. His message was of importance, for it told me that the gray car and the 4 men of Morden's party had returned to the Prospect House, on their way back to Philadelphia. "Why, I thought they had gone to Cape May," I said impulsively. "They did intend to," replied Mr. Halkett, "but they changed their plan, and they're here for the night. They're going to stay here until 11 o'clock or so tomorrow morning. They don't know I'm telling you this, as that's according to your orders." "All right, Mr. Halkett," I said seriously, "don't let them know you've telephoned me. For understand, this is an important matter. On no account raise their suspicions in any way, but see to it that they don't leave any earlier than 11 tomorrow morning." "All right, Mr. King. I'll see to that." I went back to the table, intending to tell them all what I had just heard, but on second thoughts I decided not to. So I said nothing about it until after dinner, when I told Tom Whiting only. I also told him about Irene's letter to Judson, proving that she had thought him at Cape May, whereas the party were on their return trip. He agreed with me that the situation had grown serious, and that we must move carefully. We concluded to say nothing to anyone, but to go alone next morning over to Millville. Of course I gave up my idea of another interview with Irene that night, as I wanted to keep her unaware of the fact that Judson was at Millville. Nor did I tell Hunt, as it seemed to me that Whiting and I could handle the case best alone. So next morning, immediately after breakfast, we started. The little runabout was a swift car, and we had ample time to reach Millville by 10 o'clock. But just at the last moment indeed, as I was getting into the car, Miss Lathrop ran out to speak to me. "I couldn't get a chance to tell you before," she whispered, "but Miss Gardner has sent that Judson man another letter. She had it mailed late last night, and it was addressed to Millville, and it had a special delivery stamp on it." "Thank you, Miss Lathrop," I said, and for once I was honestly grateful to her. "Speed her up, Tom," I said, as I swung into the little car beside Whiting. "We've a new reason for haste. Get over to Millville as quick as you can. Irene has sent that man another letter, and he'll get away from us yet." "Great Scott, King," said Tom, as we took a higher speed. "What is that girl up to? You know, King, there's nothing crooked about Irene." "Then she's coerced or threatened by that villain Judson," I declared. "He's the murderer, Tom, and Irene knows it." "Oh, no, no. Not so bad as that. Well, anyhow, we'll soon find out." We said little more as we tore along the miles. My thoughts were busy with this sudden new surprise. How had Irene discovered that Judson was in Millville, when a few hours before she had thought him at Cape May? To be sure, she might have had a letter or a telegram in the meantime, or, and what was more likely the case, she had heard enough of my telephoning to realize that the Mordaunt party were back at Millville, and to act accordingly. On we flew, and I said no word to Tom lest I distract his attention from his driving. Moreover, I knew the situation must mystify him quite as much as it did me. After an incredibly short trip, we whirled in at the hotel entrance. Only to be met by a distracted proprietor who told us the car had just left with the Mordaunt party. "But I told you not to let them get away," I thundered, in mad disappointment. "I know it, Mr. King," said Halkett apologetically, "but I couldn't help it. I had to go over to the bank on an important matter, and when I came back the party had just gone. Of course I couldn't forcibly restrain them." "No, I suppose you couldn't. Which way did they go?" "That way, the main road to Philadelphia." "Turn around, Tom. Chase them. It's our only chance." Whiting swung the car around, and we flew out of the gate and along the main road. "There's little hope," I shouted at him as we whizzed madly on. "But if they've had tire trouble or anything, we might overtake them. Anyway, we'll have a try at it for a few miles. And then give it up, if we have to." Whiting fully entered into the spirit of the thing, and we went faster than I had ever before traveled in a motor car. The little machine rocked, and I involuntarily grasped at the side of the seat lest I be flung out. Fortunately the road was clear, and of course a good one, and we kept on. I was just about ready to cry quits, when we saw a car ahead of us. And moreover, it was the car. "That's it, Tom!" I shouted. "Speed her!" He couldn't speed her any more than he was already doing, but as we had gained on the big car I believed we could continue to gain. And we did. Of course Mordaunt's car was not going at top speed, as they didn't know they were being pursued. A fact which I hoped they would not discover. But they did discover it. Whether a case of a guilty conscience or not, a man rose from his seat in the tonneaus and turned to look backward. He saw us, and must have realized that we were chasing them, for they immediately began to go faster. The big car sped ahead, and we followed. "Speed her, Tom!" I cried. "Whoop her up!" "Can't do any more," Tom replied. "This is our best." The poor fellow was straining every nerve, and bent to his wheel in a frenzy of excitement. The man in the car ahead was still standing and looking backward at us. The space between the cars lengthened slowly, and I realized that soon they would spin ahead out of our sight. I said nothing to Tom, for I knew he could not get another ounce of speed out of our car. The big man who stood gazing at us as the touring car streaked ahead was doubtless Jack Judson. He was an enormous man, and swung his arms with the free movement of a Westerner. Though I could not see his features distinctly, I felt the triumphant smile on his face as he took off his soft, flapping hat and waved it at us in farewell. But even as he replaced that hat I saw his face more clearly, and I suddenly realized that this meant a lessening of the distance between us. "Tom," I fairly yelled in his ear, "they're slowing down! They don't mean to, but something has happened. We're gaining on them. Never mind, boy, don't even look up. Just saw wood." Obediently Tom watched his wheel, and I stared at the car, to which we were certainly creeping nearer. Yes, slowly but steadily nearer, and now I could discern Judson's face clearly, and could see his baffled expression give way to one of new resolve. Stooping an instant, the big man straightened up again, and now in his right hand he held what was unmistakably a deadly sharpshooter. "Tom!" I cried, actually more alarmed for my unconscious companion than for myself. "Tom! Duck! He's going to shoot us!" In my excitement I didn't think of ducking myself, and I sat spellbound, gazing at that weapon aimed surely at us, while Tom, after one glance, dropped his head in an effort to shield himself. The next instant a report rang out, and as the big car passed out of sight, our pace slackened and we went along limpingly. The big Westerner had cleverly and purposely punctured one of our front tires. After the report Tom's head came up, and he evidently expected, as he was unhurt, to see me wounded or dead beside him. His look of amazement was almost comical when I said, "He shot at the tire, Whiting, not at us, and with his blooming Western skill he hit it." He had done just that, and now there was nothing for us to do but to get out and mend the tire and then go home. We did so, and though we talked the matter over all the way home, we could come to no other conclusion than that Judson was the murderer and that he had escaped us. "I shall put it straight up to Miss Gardner," I declared. "She knows about this thing, and she must be made to tell." "She must know about it," said Whiting, "but I can't believe yet that she is wilfully shielding a murderer. It must be from some mistaken sense of duty or loyalty to some one." "She's certainly very much interested in this man Judson," I returned, a little gloomily. I was really under the spell of Miss Gardner's fascination, and of course I hoped she could clear up all these uncertainties, but certainly the Judson affair looked ominous. After luncheon that day I made a special request of Miss Gardner that she would confer with Tom Whiting and myself. She agreed willingly enough, and we went to the music room for our talk. We had thought it better not to tell the rest of the household about our morning's experience until after the conference with Irene. So I had told Mr. Maxwell that the Mordaunt party had left the hotel before we reached there, and told him nothing more. But he discerned somehow that there was more to the story, and he joined us in the music room, uninvited. As there was no real reason why he shouldn't know all about it, I was quite willing he should be there. In consideration of his deafness, we all sat near together and spoke distinctly. "To begin with," I said, "I'm positive that John Judson is the man who shot Philip and Mildred." "And I am equally positive he did not," declared Irene, her eyes blazing. "And I can prove it." "You can?" exclaimed Tom Whiting. "What do you know, Irene, that the rest of us don't know? And why are you willing to defeat the efforts of right and justice?" "First, tell me what happened this morning," said the girl. So I gave a rapid account of our pursuit of the Mordaunt car, and of Judson's shooting our tire in order to make his own escape. "Then he got away safely?" asked Irene, eagerly. "Yes. He is now well on toward Philadelphia. Are you glad he escaped?" "I certainly am, as the man is absolutely innocent of any connection with our mystery." "You know this Judson, then, Miss Gardner?" asked Mr. Maxwell. "Yes, I know him very well." "Then you know he was an enemy to Philip?" "Not exactly an enemy, though I know they never liked each other. But since Mr. Judson is safely away I will tell you the whole story. He has been a friend of mine for some years, and though he has asked me several times to marry him, I have always refused him. Last week he went to see me at my home in New York, and they told him I was down here. He was making a motor trip with Mr. Mordaunt, and on their way to Atlantic City they stopped here at Mr. Judson's request. He wrote me that he wanted to see me once more before he went West, but he did not care to meet Philip. So I wrote him that I could be on the upper veranda Monday night at 10 o'clock, and that he might come up by the little outside staircase, and thus he need not see Philip at all. He did this, and it was Mr. Mordaunt's car that the Earl saw that night." "Then Judson did come up on the upper veranda Monday night at 10 o'clock," said Tom Whiting. "And yet you say he had nothing to do with the shooting." "Absolutely nothing," said Irene. "We were on the other side of the house from the library, and he remained with me not more than 2 minutes." "Why such a short stay?" asked Tom. Because I was crying when he came, and I didn't want to see him anyway, and I begged him to go away at once." "At what time was this?" "I don't know exactly, but it was quite some time after 10. In fact, Mr. King came and told me about Philip and Mildred very soon after Mr. Judson went away. But I can swear, if necessary, that he only came up to see me, stayed but a few moments and went away again. He did not go round to the library side of the house at all." "What were you crying about?" asked Whiting gently. "I was upset and nervous, and I couldn't control myself." "You have heard from Mr. Judson since?" asked Mr. Maxwell, who was paying close attention to Irene's story. "Yes, and of course he has heard of the murder, but he has no idea he was suspected of it. But I wanted him to get away, for to detain him and make inquiries would only mean trouble for an innocent man. So I wrote him at Millville that you were going over there, and begged him to get away before you came. I think he must have been mystified at my urging him to a speedy departure, but I'm glad to know that he did as I advised him." "It is a strange story, Miss Gardner," said Mr. Maxwell thoughtfully. "But of course I do not doubt your word." "You need not," said Irene haughtily. "I have told only the exact truth. If I have concealed this episode, it is only because I didn't wish Mr. Judson's name brought into question at all." We talked for some time after this, and we all agreed that as Judson was now entirely out of it, we must look in some other direction. "I don't think Mr. Hunt is doing much," said Whiting, "and I think, Mr. Maxwell, it would be wise to put the whole affair in the hands of the police." "If you think best," said the old gentleman hopelessly. "I think, myself, that Mr. Hunt is not discovering anything, but that may not be his fault. As I told you, Tom, whatever you and Peter agree upon, I will agree to. But I cannot seem to take any initiative. I am too old, and my deafness stands in my way when I would question anybody." "Certainly, Mr. Maxwell," said I, "you could not be expected to take up this matter personally. I'll see Hunt again, and if he agrees I think we will give it over to the police." But before I saw Hunt I determined to do a little more investigating by myself. I went up to the library, hoping that from the scene of the crime I could get some hint of which direction to turn. Of course, too much time had elapsed to look for further clues, but as I sat there something brought back to my mind the black spangles I had found that next morning. The maid who had found the Earl's seal must have overlooked the tiny spangles, as I found them later. But she might have found others of the same sort when she dusted the room, and I determined to ask her. I went in search of her, and showing her the spangles I had, I inquired if she had seen any like them in the library the morning she had found the seal. At first she couldn't remember, and then she recollected having picked up 2 or 3 near the window. "Have you any idea," I said, "where they could have come from? Did any of the ladies wear a spangled dress that night?" "Oh, I know where they have come from," she said quickly. "They are from the fan of Miss Gardner." "How do you know?" "Because Miss Gardner carried the black fan that evening. She left it on a seat on the veranda, and I found it and put it again in her room." "You are certain, Emily, that Miss Gardner carried the fan that evening?" "I am sure, Mr. King." That is all, Emily. You may go." Here was something definite; for I remembered distinctly that Miss Gardner went to her room to get that fan just before she and I walked together on the upper veranda. Then I left her and she remained up there, and Judson found her there crying. Meantime some spangles from that fan had dropped by the library window. It seemed to me positive proof that Irene had been around there between 9:30 and 10:30 that night. The more I thought it over the more I was convinced that it must be so. And yet I did not like to face her with these facts and ask an explanation. But it seemed to me that I must do this before going any further. So I went on my very distasteful errand, and found Miss Gardner in the music room with Miss Maxwell. "You know," I said, speaking to the girl, "it is our duty to investigate every possible clue." "Of course," said Irene, but she trembled nervously and seemed to apprehend some new disclosure. "Then I will show you these spangles," I said, taking them from my pocket-book, "and ask you if they could have dropped from a fan of yours." Irene looked at them and said quietly, "I have a black spangled fan. They may very likely have dropped from it." "Did you carry it the Monday night that Philip died?" "I may have done so. I don't remember exactly. Why?" "Because these spangles were found in the library the morning after the shooting." "And you think that turns suspicion toward me?" Irene rose, and stood with flashing eyes, the embodiment of indignation and anger. "You are entirely mistaken, Mr. King, as to your suspicions. They may be spangles from my fan; they may have been dropped in the library; but I was in and out of that room during the early evening, long before the time of the tragedy." "But you didn't have the fan with you then," I persisted, "because I remember you went to your room for it, when you and I were together after our dance." Miss Gardner turned perfectly white and swayed as if about to faint. Miss Maxwell sprang to her aid, and putting an arm about her led her from the room. "I can't have this poor girl tortured, Peter," said the gentle old lady, and they went away leaving me to face a new suspicion that was as unwelcome as it was unexpected. End of chapters 17 and 18.